This conference will now be recorded.
All right, thank you so much. So, good afternoon. Welcome to all. This is the Diversity in Libraries course at the University of South Carolina. And my name is Dr. Nicole Cook. I am the Augusta Baker Endowed Chair at South Carolina. And I am so pleased to welcome everyone to our session today. We are continuing with our Augusta Baker Diversity Lecture Series. And today we're going to be talking about microaggressions. And so it is my great pleasure to welcome Anna Coates. Anna is the head of youth services at the Livingston, New Jersey Public Library. Anna is a member of the Asian Pacific American Librarians Association, also known as APALA. She is their former secretary, member at large, and Family Literacy Focus Committee co-chair. Anna is also a former ALA emerging leader and a New Jersey Library Association emerging leader. And she is a frequent speaker on topics related to equity, diversity, and inclusion and social justice in libraries. And she is also a dear friend and colleague. So I am very grateful that Anna is able to join us today to talk about this very important, but also perhaps difficult topic, but one that we all need to be adept and up to date with as we work in libraries and information centers. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it right over to Anna.
Thank you, Dr. Cook. First and foremost, I want to say what an honor it is to be invited back by you to speak to your class. Dr. Cook has done some extraordinary, important research for the field, too much of it thankless. So I think everyone in this class is very lucky to be taking a class with her, and I can only hope to achieve half as much as she has professionally. So thank you for having me here. I think it would be remiss if I did not mention the ongoing COVID-19 situation. And I know it's been very difficult for all of us in a lot of ways. I'm coming from New Jersey, which is the second worst hit state in the country. And I'm living in Essex County, living and working in Essex County, which is the second worst hit county in New Jersey. So I just want to thank everyone for, with everything going on, coming to class today and joining us here today. So I'm going to move on to my presentation. Now, do I just do the screen share for that?
Yes, the screen share.
All right, let me share and I'll go over. All right, can everyone see, can everyone see my presentation? Okay. All right. So first, let me tell you a little bit about myself. As Dr. Cook said, I'm the head of youth services at Livingston Public Library in New Jersey. I'm of mixed heritage. I'm half white and I'm half Indo-Guyanese. So what does that mean? So it means my great-grandparents left India and moved to Guyana, which was a former British colony. It's located in South America, but it is culturally considered part of the Caribbean, probably because it's the only former British colony in South America. Sorry, I'm just looking at my notes here. And so the name of today's presentation is Microaggressions, Racial Discrimination, and the Impact on Libraries. So I'm going to be focusing on microaggressions, racial microaggressions, but this is sort of a broad term that can be applied to any form of discrimination, be it the LGBTQ community, ableism, but I'm going to focus on racial discrimination since that's where my expertise is. I do want to point out that racism and microaggressions are closely related and have similar histories and how they came to be here today. There are some scholars who do not like the term microaggressions because they feel like it downplays, the impact of racism or the history of racism. I'm not going to disagree with him, I do think there's some valid points there. That being said, I think when it goes to have conversations about improving our behaviors around this, in some ways, for some people who are maybe not as familiar with how their words or actions can be hurtful, using this terminology can really open up conversations. I also do think that, as we'll go over in the presentation, that there's definitely stuff that is blatant discrimination, and then there's some gray area where people within even one community may disagree. So if you're looking for a webinar to look for the line between racism and microaggressions, this is not the webinar for you, but we're going to be going over that history. Now, for this webinar, I'm going to ask that everyone save questions until the end. The reason being that, one, this is very information heavy, and so I just kind of want to get through the information in the time allotted. But also, I have done versions of this webinar before, and some of the questions that come up in the beginning or middle are just answered in the presentation later on. If you have a burning question, you can go ahead and enter it in the chat box, and I will get to it towards the end. Because of the way my screen is here, if there's a question that Dr. Cook you think is pressing, please, if you don't mind, please read it to me so that it gets my attention. But that being said, for when we do get to the Q&A part, I just want to cover some ground rules, and that is that we should listen actively without interruption and respect others when they are talking. Allow everyone a chance to speak. Speak from your own experience. Don't generalize. Don't be afraid to ask questions, but refrain from personal attacks. Criticize ideas, not individuals. This is a learning experience, not a debate. Comment to share information. Avoid blame, speculation, and inflammatory language. Our goal is not to agree, but rather to gain a deeper understanding and take personal and institutional action. And so with that, let's dive in. And so actually, first, can I just see yes or no? Is everyone here familiar with the term microaggression? Is this something that you've heard before? Okay, great. Seeing a lot of yeses. And so over here, I just have some general broad categories in which someone may be privileged or may be disadvantaged or marginalized. And what I would like to challenge everyone to do is, in each of these categories, think about ways in which you are privileged. And so, I can tell you all about the different, issues I've had, discrimination I've faced in the category of race and ethnicity. But myself, I am a straight cisgender woman. So I've never had to worry about things of like coming out to my family and, will my family accept my sexuality? So, even if we are marginalized in some ways, there may be other ways in which we are privileged. And even within these categories of race and ethnicity, as you can see, I am very light-skinned. I am half white. I have a white-sounding name, which was done intentionally by my mom. So, even again, as I'm seeing ways that I'm disadvantaged, and because this is impacting my life, and it's very easy for me to see the parts where I'm at a disadvantage, it is important to also keep in mind how we are advantaged. And one thing that we all have in common in this room, an advantage or a privilege that we have, is that we all either have a master's degree or we are working towards getting a master's degree. And, if you're like me, you could be sitting here like, oh my God, but, I got all these student loans and, I'm hoping to enroll in public service, student loan forgiveness, but with current administration, who knows if that's going to go through. But you know what? I had the time to get a master's. I had the prerequisites to get a master's. And that is not something that everybody has. And so we're going to start by talking about legalized racial discrimination in the USA by focusing on the impacts in New Jersey and libraries in New Jersey. And so you might be sitting here wondering, like, well, why are we going to be talking about New Jersey? I don't know if we have anyone from the Northeast here, but you know, your master's program is based in South Carolina. So this was actually born out of a presentation I did do originally for New Jersey libraries. But I think it's relevant because a lot of people tend to think of New Jersey as a liberal, progressive state, with us being so close to New York City. You know, we got Cory Booker, you know, things like this. But as we're going to talk about, racism is actually a pretty big problem in New Jersey. And, you know, growing up in New Jersey, especially in the northern and central parts of New Jersey, I was certainly raised to think of New Jersey as a state that, you know, we don't have discrimination. That's something for the South, or even if there is discrimination in this state, you know, it's in the southern part of the state, not the northern part. And, you know, even, you know, with me growing up and hearing this all the time, I believed it, even though I was seeing discrimination around me every day, every day. And so I'm from New Jersey, so I can talk about my state and air our dirty laundry. I actually think it's pretty funny. I watched the recording of last week's webinar. I thought it was funny how some problems in New Jersey got brought up. But I want to challenge everyone to also, the things we talk about today, to look into these things in your states, wherever you grew up and what you call your home state, and to kind of compare how what you've learned growing up, you know, how does that match or not match with the facts and the statistics that exist. So, and I'm going to first start with a quote from Ibram Kendi, the author of the national award-winning book, Stamped from the Beginning, The Definitive History of Racist Ideas in America. He says, I was taught the popular folk tale of racism, that ignorant and hateful people had produced racist ideas, and that these racist people had instituted racist policies. It had actually been the inverse relationship. Racial discrimination led to racist ideas, which led to ignorance and hate. Racial discrimination leads to racist ideas, leads to ignorance and hate. This is the causal relationship driving America's history of race relations. And so to just sort of paraphrase a little bit, you know, again, this is a stereotype I grew up with, that, you know, racist policies come from these ignorant and hateful people. And if only people would think differently, you know, we wouldn't have this, you know, the political structures that we do. When in fact, what has happened throughout history, and if you have the time, I really recommend this book. I really think it is a great way of looking at U.S. history, and again, to compare what we were taught versus things that were happening. And you can kind of look at, you know, things you were taught that maybe never quite made sense, but you learn not to question. But it was, in fact, just certain people who had power, who were looking to protect their interests, and made laws that would just protect their interests. And from these came the ignorance and the hate. And so to go back to talking about New Jersey, in the USA, New Jersey has the third highest Black-white youth incarceration disparity ranking and has the sixth most Black-white segregated schools, which stems from neighborhood segregation. I believe at the time of this study, the only two states that had a higher Black-white youth incarceration disparity ranking were Texas and Georgia. So going over this again, New Jersey has the third highest Black-white incarceration disparity rate in the nation, with Black kids 24.3 times more likely to be incarcerated than white kids, and Latinx youth are 5.4 times more likely to be incarcerated than white youth in New Jersey. And so kind of see some yes, no's. If you would have guessed that, you know, New Jersey would have been anywhere in the top 10 for things like the discrimination that I'm talking about here. Yeah, and I think it's really interesting. I have met people who have moved from southern states to either New Jersey or somewhere in the Northeast, be it Philadelphia or Boston or something like that. I can remember distinctly talking to two different people. Both had moved from Texas, and one moved to Philadelphia, and one had moved to Boston. And they were sort of like, "Oh my God, I knew racism was a problem in Texas. I didn't expect it to be worse here." Just sort of like their daily lives. Um, but let's move on. And so, to link this back to librarianship, how does Black-white youth incarceration disparity affect librarianship? When someone comes into your library, when someone looks suspicious or looks like they are going to cause trouble, what is the background behind these assumptions? How might youth and later adults act or act out if they know they are statistically likely to be accused of wrongdoing? So this is just a question for self-reflection, but something that I hope when you go out into the library world, or if you're already there, to sort of keep these questions in mind. And so to look more into the segregation in New Jersey, between 1989 and 2015, the number of New Jersey schools serving a majority minority student population more than doubled from 22% to 46%. And so, why this is important is we're just looking how not only is the state segregated, but it is getting much worse. And I'm just going to read the last bullet point here with the number of students attending apartheid schools, which is what this study had called this, serving 0 to 1% white students, also nearly doubled from 4.8 to 8.3%. And these schools, these apartheid schools that they're talking about, they tend to be very low funded, not as many resources, so the quality of education that children of color who attend these schools are getting is just not on par with perhaps a suburb that is right next door. And just a little bit more on the school system. In 2015, the typical white student went to a school where 67% of the total enrollment was white. The typical Latinx student also went to school where over 50% of their peers were from the same racial background. The typical Black student attended a school where 43% of students were Black and 28% were Hispanic. And although Asians made up less than 10% of the New Jersey student population, the typical Asian student went to a school where the Asian share was 28%. And so what this is saying is that if you live in New Jersey, there is a really good chance that everyone in your school looks just like you or pretty close to you. And I saw, I was watching a few of your previous webinars, so I know you've, gone over the concept of windows and mirrors and, through books, but, this is also something you can get through meeting people. And so it is in New Jersey, for a lot of students, they're getting mirrors, but not a lot of windows. And in New Jersey, let me read this, because there's a lot of information here, but New Jersey's public schools are mostly accurate reflections of the racial diversity in the districts where they are located. 75% of public schools in New Jersey serve a student population that is proportional to overall racial composition in their districts. Most school segregation is the result of segregation among districts, not within districts. Comparing the districts to the much larger counties, only one district in 5 had student enrollment that is racially proportional to the county where it is located. So in New Jersey, I'm not sure how it works in South Carolina or whichever state you are joining us from today. So in New Jersey, if you're going to public school, it is directly linked to where you live. So you don't really get a choice in where you go to school. It is just your local taxes from your township go to the schools, and then that's where you go to school. And so what this is saying is that it is really what we're looking at is the towns being segregated rather than the schools. The schools, the result of the towns being segregated. And so within counties, even right here where I live in Bloomfield. This town happens to be a little mixed, but within the town, it is segregated. The parts of the town. East Orange is very nearby, a majority Black town. I work in Livingston, where there are very, very few Black people, and these are just 5-10 minutes from each other. And so tying this back to librarianship and thinking outside the box. So what does it mean when someone who does not look like they are part of your, what does it mean when someone does not look like they are part of your community or campus? What is the history behind this assumption? And what is your library's stance on providing programs or services to people outside of your tax-paying patrons or tuition-paying students? So again, these are just some questions for self-reflection. There's no, especially the second one, there's no right answer. But something I have seen is in some libraries around here is, sometimes patrons come in, or sometimes it's myself if I'm visiting somewhere. And then, just sort of like, that person doesn't look like they're from this town. And, the question is, well, what does that mean? Now, the history of discrimination against Asians in the United States is very different from the history of discrimination against Black Americans, Native Americans, and Latinx people. So I just want to kind of take a minute and go over that history. It was certainly never taught in school when I was growing up. A lot of my knowledge from this is self-education. A great book on this, if you're interested, is The Making of Asian America by Erica Lee. But just some brief facts here. In the 18th century, I'm sorry, I'm going to be focusing, because we only, have a limited amount of time, I'm going to be focusing on the laws against Chinese immigrants. There were different laws that affected, Indian Americans, Koreans, so forth, differently. But since the largest group was from China, I'm just going to focus on that for these 2 or 3 slides. But so in the 18th century, Chinese laborers were in high demand by U.S. Companies. In 1870, there were 63,000 Chinese in the USA. In 1867, Chinese represented 90% of the Central Pacific Railroad. And by the early 1900s, Chinese immigrants had spread out to big cities across the country and mostly supported themselves by running small businesses such as laundries, restaurants, or stores. And then this is just a few laws. Despite the high demand of Chinese laborers, the U.S. passed a series of laws forbidding Chinese from entering the country. And so here was a case where the U.S. at the time did not have enough people. It did not have enough citizens. It did not have enough labor for all the work that it wanted to do, especially with westward expansion. And so here we had companies very actively recruiting from Asia saying, hey, we need this labor. We have jobs for you. We need the work done. But at the same time, the U.S. did not want this labor that they needed to settle in the U.S. and to stay here permanently. And so if you look at, say, newspaper clippings from the time on the topic, a lot of the language that was used against Asian immigrants at this time period is almost exactly the same language that we are hearing today used against Mexican immigrants, Latin American immigrants, or even, it gets applied to people of Latin descent who have been here for generations, which is another topic. Again, it's a pretty broad topic I'm talking on today, and we only have a limited amount of time. But so one law I want to point out on this slide is the 1875 Page Act that banned women suspected of prostitution as well as Asian laborers brought into the U.S. involuntarily. And this law is a fine example of interpretation of the law is very important. So with Asian women suspected of prostitution, so in order, again, the government was trying to prevent people from staying here. And one way they were trying to do that was saying, we only need men here for labor. If women come, they can have families. We don't. So pretty much this just applied to any Asian woman. And it was very hard for Asian women to immigrate to the US during this time period. And then it was not uncommon for Asian people in China or different parts of Asia to be kidnapped or to be brought here under false pretenses about work. And so what this basically did was it gave people like that no protection. So it just said, hey, you're not supposed to be here because you're here involuntarily, so you're on your own. And this just allowed people to be exploited by the companies that kidnap them. And then just a few more laws here. And I do want to point out that this was before, just a minute, I have this in my notes. Let's see. So I'm getting caught up in my notes. 1929. Before 1929, you did not need, no matter where you were coming from, you did not need any sort of paperwork to enter the US. People just sort of showed up and they hoped to be allowed in. There were things like, physical exams or, things like this. So you might be turned away based on health or something. But so if somebody has their ancestors here before 1929, and they're saying something like, oh, my ancestors came here the right way, well, they're either lying or they don't know their history, because here we are seeing the first laws from the US or really any country that barred entry based on ethnicity or country of origin. And so there was the Asian exclusion era. The Chinese Exclusion Act was not repealed until 1943. And then I'm just going to read this page. Out of the 1960s, a new Asian America was formed. First came the passage of the 1965 Immigration and Nationality Act, which liberalized the nation's immigration policy and ushered in new generations of immigrants from throughout Asia, many of whom had no connection to pre-World War II communities. So this first part is just saying how the US government did a really good job of breaking up Asian American communities. In addition to other changes, the law created immigration preference for categories based on family reunification and professional skills. Of course, that's being challenged right now. Recent immigration laws have continued that trend. The 1990 Immigration and Nationality Act, for example, increased the flow of highly skilled guest workers from abroad with temporary visas known as H-1B visas, and U.S. companies, especially in the high-tech sector, have actively recruited high-skilled workers from Asia. Asian immigrants receive about 3/4 of these visas. Indians alone receive 56% of the 129,000 H-1B visas granted in 2011. So for anyone unaware of where the stereotype like, oh, all Asians are smart or, something like this, obviously in every country you have all abilities and intelligence levels. It is just that after breaking up the pre-World War II Asian community and then allowing in immigrants from Asia, the U.S. has almost exclusively only allowed high-skilled tech STEM area workers. And in addition, another stereotype I sometimes hear about Asians is like, oh, you're not vested in this country or something, or, you have too many ties to Asia. And something important to point out is that a lot of these workers are brought over as guest workers on temporary visas. And so this last sentence, and as you know, the U.S. has quotas on how many people can become a citizen each year based on what country you're from. If you are from India and you're here on an H-1B visa, there is a 300-year wait list to become a citizen because of these quotas on where you're from. And this is a great way to prevent someone from rising up in the company, because if you accept a new position, there's a new visa that goes with that. And with that new visa starts the whole process all over again. But let us move on. So now we're going to talk about redlining and the segregation of wealth. So the development of impoverished urban areas in the U.S. is the result of institutional racism inherent in the New Deal era responses to the Great Depression. Through various government agencies and several pieces of national legislation, the federal government set out to create a broad American middle class. Now, can I see some answers? Does anyone here know who is our New Deal era president who helped get the U.S. out of the Great Depression? Yes, FDR, one of the U.S.'s most beloved presidents. FDR allowed a lot of discrimination to go on so that mainly white residents got the benefits of the New Deal era. We're going to talk about redlining. FDR was also the president who interned Japanese Americans just for their heritage. So, we're going to get to this more towards the end, but this is sort of why the, I'm a good person argument never works when dealing with racism, because the question is always, well, a nice person to who? Anyway, so these are some more of the New Deal era benefits that were given to people. And what's important to note is that if your family owns a house and they were able to get the house on a mortgage, or if you yourself get, have a house on a mortgage, this is something that came out of the New Deal era. So before this, you either had the money to buy a house outright or you didn't. And so this, we'll read the middle one here. The National Housing Act of 1934 created the Federal Housing Administration, which made homeownership possible for ordinary workers by ensuring private mortgages. In the 1930s, only 48% of Americans owned homes versus 66% today. Latinx, recent immigrants, and especially African Americans were legally and extra-legally denied New Deal opportunities. Let's see, and then I'm not sure how many people in class today had time to do some of the reading beforehand, so I might be going over things you've already read. So redlining actually started in Chicago, and this became the basis that was used for the entire country. But so here we see, for instance, the redlining rules created by the Chicago Realtors Association created maps and manuals that helped systemize home appraisals while promoting exclusion of Blacks and others from lending markets. And I'm going to jump down to the bottom here. The very presence of Black neighbors signaled an area's decline, and bank lending mostly denied. So if you've ever heard an older white person say something to the effect of, oh, I don't want, people of color moving into my neighborhood because, there goes the neighborhood. Well, this is still racist, but this used to be true. And this is a prime example. If you did the reading by Ta-Nehisi Coates that I suggested, it was gone over some examples in that neighborhood that he talked about in Pennsylvania. But this is just a prime example of how the law has led to the attitudes in some people about trying to keep their neighborhoods homogenous. Today, African American incomes are on average about 60%. Today African American incomes on average are about 60% of average white incomes. but African American wealth is about 5% of white wealth. And the reason for that is because a lot of Americans' wealth is tied to the equity in their houses. And so just a moment here, let me just look through my notes again. So in 1968, when the Fair Housing Act passed, that effectively said that African Americans are now able to buy houses in every neighborhood. You can't outright discriminate based on race. This was essentially an empty promise because houses that were affordable during the New Deal era had become expensive communities that were no longer affordable to the average person. And so to tie this back around to librarianship, so what does New Jersey education and housing segregation, as well as exclusionary U.S. immigration laws, mean for library services? So again, going back to this question, when you see a patron or a student who looks like they don't belong in your library or like they're not part of your community, what does this mean? And what is the history behind this perception? Or, to maybe phrase this in a more positive way, is if there are changes in the demographics in the community you're serving, how can you be welcoming to these new members of the community? And what does it mean for New Jersey libraryship? So again, I'm airing New Jersey's dirty laundry because I'm from New Jersey, but I would like to challenge each of you to look into your state library associations. So NJLA was founded in 1890. In this actually I think it's a little bit more than 129 years now, but anyway, in this about 130-year history, the number of people of color who have served on the executive board are, so we've only had 4 presidents who are people of color, and the last person of color who served as president was over 20 years ago. There have been no people of color who are the treasurers. So like I said, they want us in charge of the money. There have only been 4 secretaries who are people of color. The last person of color served over 10 years ago, and I believe that last person was Dr. Cook, who's from New Jersey. Yep, I see the comment. And there has only been 1 person of color to serve as executive director, and that person only served for 1 year. And so our current executive director is someone named Pat Tumulty. I would like to say she is still the executive director. In 2016, in the NJLA newsletter, Pat Tumulty released this article in which she said librarians should defend the free speech rights of neo-Nazis, the KKK, and other known people to put it mildly, not have great stances on marginalized people. So I was pretty much the only person speaking out against this. There was a lot of, so again, if we go back to these numbers of POC who've been welcomed into the e-board, this sort of trickles down into the general membership. So a lot of people were basically saying, yeah, this is fine. And I'm going to switch over to ALA. And I know in last week, this was covered a little bit, but in June 2018, the ALA Office of Intellectual Freedom, headed by James LaRue, reinterpreted the Library Bill of Rights to say libraries must welcome hate groups. And so you can see here the highlighted part. A publicly funded library is not obligated to provide meeting room space to the public, but if it chooses to do so, it cannot discriminate or deny access based upon the viewpoints of speakers or the content of their speech. This encompasses religious, political, and hate speech. And there was some outcry about this. This is a Twitter thread that, if you are interested in the background behind this decision, this gives some background on this. We're not going to go over that all today, but the takeaway here is there was enough outcry over ALA's decision that our voices made a difference, and the ALA Office of Intellectual Freedom amended this interpretation, so it's now gone. But if you go to their website, it's still up there as a record. You can see the what I had on the previous slide. I'm happy to hear that they now have materials on what to do and how to prevent hate groups from coming to your library. Unfortunately, there was not enough outcry in New Jersey, so that message still stands in New Jersey. But so we've gone over all the heavy stuff, but so what do we do about this? What are our strategies for dealing with these things? And so I have a few strategies here, and the first one I want to go over is self-education. And I do want to say that the country we live in is founded on racism, right? So like one lie that we hear is that, oh, the United States was built on the Protestant work ethic. That's why it's successful, or, you know, we were able to do this. When we know the United States was built on slave labor. You know, it was a lot of unpaid labor, terrible conditions. The descent, you know, there have been I'm sorry, I'm blinking right now. There have been no reparations. And so I do honestly feel that if we are not constantly self-educating ourselves, you know, we are just going to passively take in the messages that are all around us in the media. You know, perhaps the interpretation of U.S. history that we learned in schools was not all-encompassing. And so I'm not sure how many people here had time to watch the YouTube video I recommended from Jay Smooth's 2011 TED Talk, How I Learned to Stop Worrying and Love Discussing Race. And what Jay Smooth says is, you know, racism is not logical, and it tends to people tend to view it as an all or nothing. So it's either, you know, I'm not racist and I don't make any mistakes, or, you know, I am racist and there's no in between, there is no room for self-growth. And he's saying, well, maybe we should view this more as like a hygiene thing, so that we can improve upon ourselves and we recognize there's some maintenance there. And so here I have, you know, if somebody's giving you some feedback that, hey, you know, the thing you said there was a little racist, you know, some comebacks I'm sure we all heard at some point, either said to us or said to somebody you're hearing, is, you know, I'm not racist, I'm a good person, you know, I have coffee with Black people, you know, what, one of my relatives is gay, you know, there's just no way I'm racist. Which again, Jay Smooth goes over how, as much as we may try to say like, hey, I'm trying to focus on the thing that you said, not you as a person, people often just turn this into like a who I am type thing. But so using his argument, you know, about hygiene and how this is, you know, more about maintenance and constantly trying to improve ourselves, what would these, and I'm basing this from his talk, how would similar responses sound if someone pointed out that there was something in your teeth? And they might go, you know, I'm not a dirty person, I'm a clean person. You know, I have coffee with dentists. One of my relatives owns a toothbrush. You know, I'm a physician, so there's no way there's something stuck in my teeth. You know, I brush my teeth twice a day, so there's no way there's something stuck in my teeth. And so anyway, if we ever have time to meet and, you know, we become friends, I'm definitely that person who tells you there's something in your teeth. in both senses here. But I want to say that myself as an individual, as much as I hate making mistakes, it is hard to admit when we make mistakes. I want someone to tell me when there's something in my teeth, because I don't want to go around looking dumb. I want someone to tell me so that I can correct the problem. Let's see. And then also developing cultural literacy, understanding microaggressions within marginalized communities. And so again, some questions for self-reflection is to ask yourself, what have I done to educate myself about the marginalized communities that I serve? Have I only relied on information given to me by individuals, or have I done qualified research? So something I sometimes hear in library panels is, hey, you're trying to do a program for people of color in your community. Why don't you ask some patrons what they want? And this is a great start. We want to involve our community. We want buy-in. But your average person on the street does not have a PhD in cultural studies. We can't expect people to know everything about their communities. And as we're about to get into in a minute, even within marginalized communities, there are marginalized groups within that group. And everybody has their own biases. So we need to be doing our own research to make sure we are providing the most inclusive programs possible. Strategy 2, implement strong policies. So this here is an excerpt from the Livingston Public Library's program policy. I worked on this with my director, and I was really insistent that we needed some language that said, we need to protect ourselves in case a group like the KKK or neo-Nazis wants to rent some space here, which, I would hope it's unlikely in the particular library I work in, but you never know. And my director at the time was really into this idea of free speech and not limiting expression. I would like to point out that if somebody were to get up and say something like, I hate white people, all white people should die, and here is my plan about what I'm going to do, they get locked up and called terrorists, as they should. We should not be having violence against anybody. Yet, the KKK does exactly that, and there's people who go, hey, whoa, free speech. And so there were a number of cases across the country that I just kept sending to my director and saying, well, what would we do with this situation? And so she got on board and said, yeah, I don't want to deal with this, so let's make sure our program policy reflects this. So we have this language. All library programs are meant to be inclusive without the promotion or use of hateful ideology or speech. Strategy number 3, provide services and programs that embody diversity, equity, inclusion, and social justice. And so actually on this next slide, I have a picture of the Civic Lab from Skokie Public Library in Illinois. Now, Skokie is funded differently than any New Jersey public library is, and I think this is part of why they're able to have such progressive programs. I definitely do programs of, close to this nature. I hope to get to this level where they can do something like the Civic Lab. If you can go to their website, you're going to see more on this. But I think I heard, if I remember correctly, because the idea of intellectual freedom and speech was part of your webinar last week. And I think somebody made a comment of, well, if you're having a program that is anti, trans community, what message is this sending to the trans community? And I'm definitely behind that line of thought. What message are we sending our communities with the programs that we do? And so if we really do have this message of all are welcome, what are we doing to actually let everyone know they are welcome here? And strategy 4, understanding nuance. And so I just have a slide here of a meme you may have seen. White privilege is your history being part of the core curriculum and mine being taught as an elective. Or might I add, as a West Indian person, not being taught at all. So just a show of hands here is to, again, just like highlight how much we don't know about not white history in the US. How many people here know or knew ahead of before me saying this, that there are more Hindus in New York City from the Caribbean than there are directly from India? Yeah, and so this is a thing where, so you know, obviously with this, there's a large West Indian population in this area, but this is something when I share with other Guyanese people, other Indo-Guyanese people, they also don't know this. And so we're a part of the community here, and we don't even know this because it's just something not taught. So the idea that, you know, we're all equal, you know, anyone who says like, oh, you know, inequality is a thing of the past, you know, an easy way to counter this is to just ask them how much they know about a non-dominant culture and how much it is not taught, how much it is not represented in the media, how you can be in New York City, part of a community, as I'm saying, and not even know what your representation is. And so just to kind of dive into this idea of understanding marginalization within marginalized communities, you know, just some like questions that came to my mind. Is there an Indian cultural organization in your community or on campus that only focuses on Hindu traditions? You know, are you aware of the number of Muslim and Christian Indians that there are? Is there an Indian organization that only focuses on Northern and Central Indian culture? Are you aware of the marginalization of South and Northeastern Indian states? Is there a Latinx organization that excludes Afro-Caribbean and or Afro-Latin American culture or excludes Asian Caribbean culture? Does your library call it Chinese New Year or Lunar New Year? Are there ethnically non-Chinese people in your community who celebrate this holiday? And so again, you know, if you're just asking somebody, depending on who you're asking, they may be a person who's part of the majority in this from their culture and not even be aware of the people not represented in their own communities. So that's where it's up to us as information professionals to do the research, do what we can to make sure we're reaching out to everyone. And then I'm sorry, I know we're getting close to the end here. So is something a microaggression? So we're going to go over a little bit the gray area I talked about in the beginning. Microaggressions aren't always clear. Members of the same marginalized group don't always agree on what is and what isn't a microaggression. Microaggressions are about how people from marginalized groups feel, do not deny or dismiss how someone feels. Microaggressions can be hard to recognize when you are part of the dominant group, and be aware of the power of your words and actions. And so this here is a meme from a few years ago when Donald Trump made some comment about people from shithole countries. So somebody made this, took this picture, the bookstore had done a display, writers from shithole countries, and there were mixed reactions to this. You know, some people from the countries in question, or, you know, who had ancestors from the countries in question thought this was funny. Other people thought it was not, said, you know, my country's not a shithole. But so if someone points out that something you say or post is offensive, do not say, you know, you're wrong, this isn't offensive, you're the one who's racist. There are bigger issues in the world. Why are you making a big deal of this little thing? And in this next slide, this was a picture from last year's summer reading poster. And so this woman did the right thing, in my opinion. So this was a white woman who received this poster, and she posted in Storytime Underground and said, basically, hey, I got this poster for summer reading. You know, I'm white, I'm not Asian, so I'm looking for more input. And the yellow skin tone on the apparently Asian characters here, you know, I'm not sure how I feel about that. And so, you know, there is, you know, stuff like The Simpsons, you know, maybe this is like the world they're going for here. But we can see there's 3 other kids who do not have yellow skin tones. And so, unfortunately, well, I have good news and bad news. Unfortunately, like going back to the things you should not say, there was a lot of response, sort of like, you know, how can you say this could possibly be a problem? You know, a lot of work went into this. The good news is the posters got changed. So I was not in the first round to get these posters. So when I did get the posters, there were not yellow people in the posters. So if somebody says something to you, point out that, hey, you know, I think this might be a little problematic. You know, some responses you could have is, you know, I didn't think about it that way. You know, it's quite possible. You know, I didn't realize this could be hurtful or offensive. You know, I'm sorry, I hadn't thought about this perspective before. And then especially this last one, if you're really, you know, need some time to think, you know, I hadn't considered this before. Can I have some time to think about this before responding? And so our last strategy, number 5, responding to microaggressions. In general, find allies, support groups in your library, department, your campus, or in your community, professional development groups or online spaces, practice self-care. In the moment or after the moment, take a step back and decide how you want to respond. You know, if you want, you could turn the situation into a teaching or a learning moment if you have the energy for it that day. Some strategies for the microaggressed. You know, some comments or feedback you can have is, I didn't think that comment was very inclusive. What did you mean by that? This makes me feel uncomfortable. I'm offended by that. Can I give you some feedback? And for the upstander, so maybe for somebody who's witnessing this but is not on the receiving end of the comment, you know, feel free to interject. You know, I don't think that comment was inclusive. What do you mean by that? This makes me feel uncomfortable. I'm offended by that. Can I give you some feedback? And for the microaggressor, and you know, this can happen to any of us, regardless of your color. As we went over, even within your own group, you can have disagreements with people of your own community of if something is offensive or not. But so don't fake apologize, you know, dismiss or ignore, or rely on the microaggressor to teach you. So what you should do is call yourself out and apologize immediately, acknowledge your bias, listen and reflect, you know, research and learn. I'm going to jump back real quick. I should have probably put this comment there. You know, this last one again, you know, can I have some time to think about this? It is quite possible if you're learning something new, you need some time to process and really think about it. But so that brings us to the end. So does anyone have any questions? I'm going to bring this back to slide number 2 with our ground rules. Let's see. Oh, hey, Sarah. You're welcome for the distinction with the Chinese Lunar New Year distinction. And I do also, oh, sorry, go on, Nicole.
No, go ahead. I was just going to say thank you, but continue.
I'll say, if anyone has questions, something in general, you know, you're not sure if it's okay to say something or not, This isn't a learning environment we're in, so I want to say feel free to ask that question at this point.
Yes, and I second that. So while folks are coming up with their questions, I just want to say thank you for this. For the folks in the audience, particularly those who don't know Anna personally, Anna is a straight shooter. So I love to hear Anna give a presentation and tell you what's what. And as Anna mentioned, I am originally from New Jersey. I spent my entire career as a practicing librarian in New Jersey. And one of the towns she mentioned, East Orange, that's actually where I'm from. And it is, very much just as Anna described. I worked as a public librarian for a short time, and then most of my career was as an academic librarian. And I worked in predominantly white, affluent towns that I could never afford to live in. So it is, very much that landscape still exists. So I see there's one question already from Dylan. Dylan says, what is a good way to detect microaggressions we might not be fully aware of? Or he says self-aware of.
So I'm going to use myself as an example. So because I'm mixed, so this is something I've dealt with my whole life. So, my family has maybe not always been very aware of things. And so from a young age, I've started, self-educating myself on not just, my racial group, but other racial groups. So that's where my interest is. But I would say recognize your weak spots. So because, for example, in my personal case, from my younger age, I was interested in racial equality. I really need to do more work on LGBT awareness. And this is something I do not in any way see as a burden. In fact, I view this as something that is so wonderful that there is writing out there and people who are willing to talk about it that I can learn. So if my mission is really to make sure everyone is welcome in the library, how can I best support that? And so, again, so my answer to your question is basically identify wherever you think you have, I don't know if weakness is the right word, but where you need maybe more awareness because it's not part of your everyday life. And, in all, I had the slide about, the different categories in which we can be privileged or marginalized, and to do the research so that you are more aware of issues that affect the different communities. Does this answer your question? I'm sorry, go on.
No, Dylan can type in the box whether that question was answered. I was just going to read Emily's comment. I appreciate the idea to respond with, what do you mean by that? I'm usually stunned, speechless when I hear something that I feel is a microaggression, which I later feel very guilty about. So Emily said that she'll be using that question in the future.
Well, thank you for that feedback. I know I myself, as much as I've either experienced or witnessed things, sometimes in the moment, even though it's happened before, so sometimes it still feels shocking in the moment. And sometimes I want to take a moment to respond, especially if I'm in like a work situation and I need to carefully phrase how I'm going to respond. So I love phrases like that as well.
If I can add to that, some of the trainings that I've been in and some that I've actually conducted on this topic and in this area, the suggestion is to actually come up with a script. And I'm not necessarily suggesting role playing. I mean, if role playing is your thing, have someone be the microaggressor, have someone be the one that's being microaggressed against, and actually practice the scenarios. But it could just be as much as looking up different scripts, different responses. And, you know, like a lot of things, this could be a matter of practicing, right? So if you are practicing some of these comments, you know, like, what do you mean by that? Or I'm offended by that, the list that Anna had, and just kind of, you know, make them part of your repertoire. So the next time something comes up, it's not to say that it won't sting or it won't make you mad, but you'll have something a little closer to pull from to address something in the moment, as opposed to, you know, waking up like I do in the middle of the night saying, oh, this is what I should have said like 15 hours ago. All right, so Jordan has a question. Do you have any strategies for when you call someone, in parentheses, a patron, out for a microaggression and they respond in a hostile or aggressive way?
So my first part of my answer to that is going to say is to check in with management and see how much support you have from management, and then to check in with yourself about how you feel about the level of support you are getting from your management. So something I do with patrons, so I'm head of youth services, so the majority of who I work with is children and teens. So in some ways, I feel like I have an advantage over an adult services librarian, because teens and kids more or less know they're supposed to listen to you. You know, they push boundaries, but they know they're supposed to listen to you. Adult patrons, maybe not the case. So something that I find is effective is to basically repeat back to them what they said, or keep repeating, what do you mean by that? And, you know, if you keep saying, what do you mean by that? And, you know, they're trying to explain themselves and, you know, or get flustered. But with this, they're sort of leave, you know, they might get flustered and leave, versus, you know, with adults, patrons, not, you know, it'd be different for coworkers. I might not necessarily be looking for that teachable moment because I don't know how they're going to respond. I'm just going to keep on with the, what do you mean by that? And let it be known that was not acceptable. Or, you know, or depending on what it is, that I'd say, hey, that's not acceptable. You just can't say that here. If you have an example, I might be able to give more of an answer.
Anna, I have an example, or maybe an example that would fit with this. I know that a lot of folks are sheltered in place and they're at home, so maybe this hasn't come up yet. But in light of the COVID situation, with the extreme racism, xenophobia, and violence that's happening against Asian Americans and members of Asian communities, when libraries reopen, it is possible, you know, that someone might say, I don't want that, you know, insert whatever person. I don't want that person here because they brought that disease over here and they're going to make me sick. And so that could be an example of, you know, someone saying, you know, to you as a staff person, making a more, I think, than a microaggression. It's really more of a macroaggression, but making some type of statement that the library staff might then have to respond to.
So this is something that has been on my mind. I do work in a library with a high East Asian population. And so in that situation, I would just sort of respond with facts and be like, well, you know, coronavirus spreads easily. You know, anyone can have it. Anyone can be asymptomatic. And, you know, if the person accepts this, you know, wouldn't that be great? You know, they just accept it immediately. It's fine. But if they're sort of insisting that, you know, oh no, you know, Asians are the start of it, or the problem, I would just, you know, I would just say, the language you're using right now, the ideas you're expressing are not acceptable, you know, and I would go back to the fact, anyone can have this. You know, if you are uncomfortable here, you can leave. To be quite honest, I don't know if you have it, and I think you're standing too close to me, or, you know, something like that. But that's me, you know. I'm not sure if everyone quite as aggressive an approach.
Yeah, I do. But to your point, I mean, I think you have to get to that point. But yeah, and I do with that want to just kind of circle back to Anna's previous response. You know, everything is not a teaching and learning moment, as much as we want it to be. And the idea of, you know, really knowing in advance the type of support that you have from your leadership and management will unfortunately, for better or for worse, influence the types of decisions and kind of responses that you can have. I worked at a place where I knew that wasn't going to fly. Now, were there times where there were calculated risks and I felt like I needed to, you know, say something because that was part of, you know, how I could look myself in the mirror every morning? Yeah, there were some calculated risks. And, you know, if I said something that was then reprimanded, then that's just what it was. And then there were other days where, you know, that just wasn't the battle I could pick. And to very much Anna's point, just lead with facts and this idea that that language is unacceptable. Are there other questions or comments for Anna?
Thank you, everyone. I know we're going a little bit over time. I really appreciate everyone logging in today and joining me here today.
So please join me in thanking Anna. It is, as always, been an honor and a pleasure to hear from you and to have you come share your expertise with us. Thanks, as always, to the students in the class, and thank you so much for our special guests that are logged in. Always grateful to have you as well. So with that, please be well and hope to see you at another lecture. Anna, thank you so much.
Thank you.